In this segment, more speculation and alternate views from the governing body about what we want to do with this generation. Ray Franz says a number of members, however, did voice their support for the organization's existing teaching about this generation and the 1914 date. Lloyd Barry expressed personal dismay that doubts existed within the body regarding the teaching. Referring to Lyman Swingle's reading of statements from the 1922 Watchtowers, he said that he saw nothing to be concerned about in these, that they were present truth for the brothers at that period. Ray Franz goes on, as to the oldness of the 1914 generation, he pointed out that in some parts of the Soviet Union there are regions where people live to 130 years old. He urged that a united position be expressed to the brothers so that they would maintain their sense of urgency. Others expressed concurring views. And then Ray Franz comments on the nature of truth when present truth is your leading concept of what truth can do, and he reasons this way. When later recognized by the chairman, my comment was that it seemed that we would need to keep in mind that what is today taught as present truth may also in time become past truth, and that the present truth that replaces such past truth may itself become replaced by future truth. I felt that the word truth used in such a manner became simply meaningless. A couple of the body members said that if the current explanation was not the right one, then what was the explanation of Jesus' statements? Since the question seemed aimed at me, my response was that I felt there was an explanation that harmonized with Scripture and fact, but that anything presented should surely not be some spur-of-the-moment idea, something carefully researched and weighed. But then, of course, the question becomes, where do you do the research? And we know Ray Franz had already done research outside the organization for the aid book preparation. I said that I thought there were brothers capable of doing that work, but that they would need the governing body's authorization. Was the governing body interested in having this done? There was no response, and the question was dropped. I think at this point of a scripture that was often used in my hearing about those who withdrew from the organization or removed themselves from consistent fellowship and didn't come to meetings perhaps. And that was the passage in Proverbs 18:1. One isolating himself will seek his own selfish longing. As a matter of fact, that scripture was used to Vivian by her family when I ceased to go to the meetings, that I had no place to go essentially but down, according to their understanding of that passage. But what Ray Franz was suggesting here is that this might apply to the organization itself. An organization that isolates itself from research outside its own cocoon is prone to this type of ad hoc or expedient reasoning. So Ray Franz's inclination to do the research and get back to doing some serious, maybe outside the box research on the issue of the generation was met with, well, no response. At the discussion's end, with the exception of a few members, the body members indicated that they felt that 1914 and the teaching about this generation tied to it should continue to be stressed. The writing committee coordinator, Lyman Swingle, commented, "All right, if that is what you want to do, but at least you know that as far as 1914 is concerned, Jehovah's Witnesses got the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel from the Second Adventists." And Franz goes on, perhaps one of the most disturbing things to me was knowing that while the organization urged the brothers to maintain unwavering trust in the interpretation, there were men in responsible positions within the organization who had themselves manifested that they did not have full confidence in the predictions based on the 1914 date. A notable example, at the time of the February 19th, 1975 session, in which the governing body listened to Fred Franz's tape talk on 1975, there followed some discussion about the uncertainty of time prophecies. Nathan Noer, then the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, spoke up and said this, quote, "There are some things I know. I know that Jehovah is God, that Jesus is his son, and that he gave his life as a ransom for us, and that there is a resurrection. Other things I'm not so sure about. 1914, I don't know. We have talked about 1914 for a long time. We may be right, and I hope we are. I remember Vivian's brother-in-law, John Federico. The last time we saw him, when he came to help me get my spiritual sense back, we discussed the finished mystery and the 1914 date, and his attitude was much stronger than Nathan Noor's expressed attitude here, namely that, well, we must be right about 1914. We've been preaching it. Well, that was about the year 1988. John's attitude was, we've been preaching this for 3 generations. It must be right. We can see that within the governing body there was no such certainty. Ray Franz goes on, at that session the date under discussion was 1975, so it came as a surprise that the far more fundamental date of 1914 should be referred to in such a context. As stated, the President's words were spoken not in private conversation, but before the governing body in session. Previous to the major discussion of 1914, in the 1979 November 14th session, the body's writing committee had discussed the advisability of continuing to stress 1914. In the committee discussion, it was suggested that we might at least refrain from pushing the date. As I recall, Carl Klein reminded us of the practice sometimes followed of simply not mentioning a certain teaching for a time, so that if any change came, it would not make such a strong impression. Remarkably, the writing committee voted unanimously to follow basically that very policy in the publications with regard to 1914. This position, however, was short-lived, since the November 14th, 1979 full session of the governing body made clear that the majority favored emphasizing the date as usual. And if we needed one, there's a very good case, an argument for discouraging democracy. We've already seen that several key members of the governing body did not have certitude regarding the date, and yet the majority voted to, well, business as usual. Ray Franz goes on, that questions about this teaching were not limited to Brooklyn was brought home to me by an incident occurring while I was on a trip to Nigeria in 1979. In Nigeria, 2 members of the branch committee and a longtime missionary took me to see a property that the society had purchased for constructing a new branch headquarters. On the return trip, I asked what they expected to be able to when they expected to be moving to the new site. The reply was that with the clearing of the land, obtaining approval of plans, was getting necessary permits, the actual construction might well be by 1983. And the move would probably take at least that long. Because of this, I asked, do you get any questions from the local brothers as to the length of time that has passed since 1914? There was a momentary silence, and then the branch coordinator said, no, the Nigerian brothers seldom ask questions of that kind, but we do. Almost immediately, the long-time missionary said, Brother Franz, could it be that Jesus' reference to this generation applied only to the persons back there who saw the destruction of Jerusalem? If that were the case, then everything would seem to fit. That, again, is the preterist position that has long been held by a great many scholars in the churches. Ray Franz goes on, quite evidently, not everything did seem to fit in his mind, the way the existing teaching had it. My reply was simply that I supposed that such was a possibility, but there was not much more that could be said for the idea. I repeated this conversation to the governing body after my return, for it gave evidence to me of the questions existing in the minds of men throughout the world, respected men in positions of considerable authority. The comments the men in Nigeria made and the way they made them indicated clearly that they had discussed the question among themselves before ever my visit took place. Shortly after my return from Africa, in a governing body session on February 17, 1980, Lloyd Barry again voiced the feelings his feelings about the importance of the teaching regarding 1914 and this generation. Lyman Swingle said that the questions from readers' material published in 1978 had not settled the matter in the brothers' minds. Albert Schroeder reported that in the Gilead School and in the branch committee seminars, brothers brought up the fact that 1984 was now being talked about as a possible new date. 1984 being 70 years from 1914. The figure 70 evidently being looked upon as having some special import. The body decided to discuss the matter further in the next session. And in the next segment, we will address a surprise. Several governing body members come forward with the changing of the date from 1914 to 1957.